I'm 40, but I feel like a child watching everyone around me get older and die. So I'm homesick for the past instead of accepting the terrifying present. How can I stop mourning the past? Well, I grouped the last three questions together, including this one, because they all allowed me to talk reasonably about these programs. The self-authoring program has a past authoring component that helps people write out an autobiography. Now, you're suffering from what Freud described as reminiscences of the past. You're possessed by reminiscences. They won't get out of your mind. And what that means to me is, well, it's one of two things. One is that there's things in your past that you need to understand more deeply. And that's why they're still calling to you. And there are things in your past that you had, perhaps, that you need to have in the present and the future. And so you could do the past authoring program and write out your past. It asks you to detail the most emotionally significant events that occurred during different epochs or stages of your life. So you have to break your life into a number of stages. I think we recommended 6, but you can break it into as many as you want or as few. And then to detail out the significant positive and negative occurrences, that stand out in your memory from those times. And that'll kind of help put the past to rest, but it also might highlight for you what it is that you're nostalgic for. And then that can help you figure out what to aim for in the future. And so, it sounds like you're rather hopeless about the present and by implication, the future. And maybe that's because you don't have a richly enough developed conception of what it could be. So you could go back to your past and find out what it is that you wanted and had, and then you need to make a plan for how you might obtain that in the future. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that because you talked about death, and so you may be longing in some sense for a return to in a state of blissful ignorance where you weren't concerned about mortality. And, the only real medication for that, I think that's real, is to live as worthwhile a life as you can, as full a life, so you don't have regrets. I'm not sure that so much that people are afraid of death. They're maybe afraid of not living enough. And maybe if you lived enough, you could let it go when it was time. I think there's some truth in that. And so if you're overly afraid of death, it may be because you have a lot of unlived life in you. And you can go back to the past and you can find out what you needed and perhaps had then, and then you can strive to attain that in the present and the future. And those exercises could, at least in principle, help you with that. So what are you missing, right? What are you missing that the past had for you? And maybe you write that down, like, well, I had this and it was really important to me, and I had a loving relationship with someone and I don't have that now. I had the security of a comfortable home life and I don't have that now. It's, well, those are things that now become ambitions, right? Because an ambition and a lack are mirror images of one another. And so if you can identify what you lack, you can derive an ambition from that. And you might say, well, that's impossible. It's like, well, you decompose it into small steps. And that's complicated, but so life is complicated. So there's no way around that. What's your advice to someone who took your Understand Myself test and scored 0 on agreeableness, but still recognizes the need to collaborate with many people? Well, that's an interesting question. 0 is pretty low. The best personality predictor of imprisonment, conduct, behavior, antisocial personality, criminality is low agreeableness. Now, it's not a very powerful predictor, at least as it's measured with self-report questionnaires, but it's the most powerful predictor. And so if you're low in agreeableness, you will have the proclivity to be less empathetic and sensitive to other people than they might like. And you might also be harsh and stubborn. And there's advantages, right? You'll tell the truth more likely because you're not so concerned about upsetting people. You're likely more difficult to stop. And there's some utility in that once you're set on your pathway. But it's reasonable for you to take a good look at that, because it could easily cause you and other people a fair bit of trouble. Now, I don't know the rest of your personality configuration. So, if you're conscientious, but low in agreeableness, well, then you'll be able to keep and maintain contractual obligations. The sense of duty, which isn't the same as the empathic sense that indicated by agreeableness, the sense of duty will keep you to your word. So if you're high in conscientiousness, well, then you can rely more on contractual obligation. Like, what's the deal here? What's my end of the deal? What do I have to do to uphold that? So it has to be more explicit rather than implicit, because you're not going to be a good gauge of other people's emotional state. And you said yourself, personally, I feel almost zero regard for the emotions of those around me, yet I can't avoid them and complete what I need to do at the same time. Okay, so you have a strategic problem as well. So you also might consciously practice doing things for other people, and you'd have to do that strategically. There is some evidence, and I don't remember where I ran across this, that doing so is a facilitator of mental health. And so you might have to learn to act agreeable more explicitly. When you're undertaking something with someone, you may have to learn to ask yourself explicitly, what's in it for them, right? Why is this an equitable arrangement? And if you're conscientious, that's going to be an easier thing to understand. So, well, what can you do about being so low in agreeableness? Well, you can capitalize on your other personality traits. Maybe you're high in openness, and so what you can offer to other people is the opportunity to collaborate with you in a creative endeavor. And they might leap at that opportunity. Maybe you're extroverted. Now, extroverted, disagreeable people tend to be narcissistic, so that's a rough one. Because if you're extroverted and disagreeable, well, then your narcissism is going to be problematic. And that's especially true if you're low in conscientiousness, because then you won't be able to keep verbal contracts either. So, but if you're extroverted, let's say, well, you do have the option of being entertaining and enthusiastic, and that's something you have to offer other people. So you have to look at your entire personality constellation and figure out what you need to rely on to rectify those areas where you're where you deviate substantially from the norm. You may also need to find someone in your life who is agreeable, assuming they can stand you. They might be attracted to you just out of perverseness, and ask for their opinion, because their superior empathic sense, let's say, might lay them open to exploitation. That's the downside of high agreeableness, by the way. But they're going to be much more attuned to the social niceties of a given situation. And so you might need to ally yourself with someone who's clearly more empathic and control your tendency to take advantage of them if you can. So, and then the last thing I said, well, practice, doing things for other people. You might have to do it coldly and calculatingly, at least to begin with, because you don't have that easy empathic sense, but that doesn't mean it has to be false. It depends on what it's in service of. And if it's in service of rectifying and maintaining your relationships with other people, then that's an admirable goal, even if it's a cold cognitive goal rather than a warm and heartfelt goal. And so it's certainly better than the alternative, which is to not do it at all. So, maybe you have to do something altruistic once a week or something like that as part of your attempt to broaden the scope of your personality. And then maybe you could have the advantages of being disagreeable, which means, for example, that you're no pushover and that, you'll pursue your own agenda, that you'll strive to win and so forth. You could have the advantages of that and some of the advantages of being someone whose empathy makes them easier to get along with and to collaborate with other people.